At the start of 1945, the Second World War had not necessarily developed in favor of Germany, especially the ships of the Kriegsmarine, of which a majority of the larger ships had been sunk already. However, the German fleet still had a number of cruisers, destroyers, and even some antiquated battleships to assist in the defense of the Baltic as the Soviets advanced into the German homeland itself. Most of these ships were destroyed in the defense of the Third Reich, and those that remained were divided up amongst the victors. In today's video, we're going to cover the exploits of the last large German ships in the final months of the war. Before we get into it, we're going to cover the exploits of the ships larger than destroyers, as if we discussed those in the video, it would run a little long. We'll only be discussing those ships in active roles, so mobile ships like the Gneisenau we won't be discussing, or those still in building like Seydlitz or Graf Zeppelin. Anyway, starting off with an interesting one, the Admiral Hipper. We'll pick up the story of the Admiral Hipper in January 1945, where she was returning to service following damage and recommissioning following the disastrous Battle of the Barents Sea. Crew members were again sent away from the ship to aid in the construction of more fortifications in the area of Gdynia. Meanwhile, the cruiser went on to the yard in Gottenhofen halfway through the month. Due to further air attacks and the worsening military situation, the repair work was hampered. By the end of the month, due to that terrible military situation, the ship was used to carry refugees to Kiel, some 1,500 people. While on this voyage, the ship passed the sinking liner Wilhelm Gustloff and cruised through survivors in the water, unable to stop because of the danger of Soviet submarines. By the 1st of February, the cruiser was secured in Kiel at the Deutsche Werke shipyard for boiler restoration work. A little over a month later, on April 3, 1945, the ship was bombed. By this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. The civilian populations of the cities had to hide in cellars, bunkers, or ruins, especially in the bombed-out city of Kiel. In the bombing raid of April 3rd, the ship received a direct hit on the starboard side, and 6 crew members were killed. On the 9th, in another bombing raid, the one that devastated the Admiral Scheer also devastated the Admiral Hipper, as the RAF dropped some 2,634 tons of explosives on the city. 3 more direct hits destroyed the Admiral Hipper's upperworks and superstructure, as you can see from this photo, which does an excellent job illustrating the carnage of the raid and the damage to the Admiral Hipper, especially in the foreground, the superstructure, and the funnel. The crew was not on board when the raid took place, taking shelter in the nearby U-boat pens, so there were no casualties on board the ship. Another great photo taken by British authorities was this color one, taken from the rear of the ship, and it also does an excellent job illustrating the damage done to the Admiral Hipper. Notice the damage here, and the overall condition of the ship. This was probably the most famous photo besides those of the Admiral Scheer capsized in Kiel after the war, at least for naval history fans. The wreck of the Admiral Hipper was essentially useless now, as the bombs had devastated the ship, and certainly beyond any means of repair that Germany could have conducted at the time. So when May rolled around, the ship was scuttled in its dry dock. Then, when the British took over the city in May, the ship was found in that condition. To take from Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War the fate of enemy fleets after 2 world wars, on May 23rd, a British status report of vessels at Kiel noted that T1, lying on her side, S201, and M801 had been blown up on May 20th, and on the following day, depth charges had been detonated under the hulks of Admiral Hipper and Emden. This was judged enough to render them destroyed by the deadline. The wrecks were broken up in situ from 1948 onwards, the Eisen und Metall concern having quoted for their scrapping in April. In July, under the supervision of British authorities, the remains were raised and towed to Heikendorf Bay and beached so that the scrapping process could begin. The scrapping process began in 1948 and lasted until 1952. Where in this photo, the Admiral Hipper is suffering from an accidental fire as she was dumped in shallow water after the removal from the dry dock in June 1945. Refloating the Admiral Hipper was not permitted by the Potsdam Agreement, since she was not forming an obstruction to navigation. Rather, her hull was damaged beyond salvage by the detonation of those charges we discussed earlier, and thus not worthy of saving, being scrapped over the coming years. Our story with Prince Eugen begins back in mid-1944 after recommissioning in 1943 and joining the Fleet Training Group. If you want to learn more about the decommissioning of all heavy units, I'll link to the playlist for this series. Anyway, in June 1944, Prince Eugen patrolled the Finnish coast north of the island of Ltzow in a show of strength to cover the German withdrawal when Finland was going to leave the war. In July, there wasn't much of anything to note for her service. In August, however, there was quite a bit of action, as off Kurland in the Gulf of Riga, the cruiser spent 265 rounds of her main battery, 20.3cm or 8-inch guns, on Soviet positions at Tukum, a rail and road junction about 25 kilometers inland, while our escorting destroyers and torpedo boats engaged other targets. On the 2nd of September, she returned to Finland following the nation bowing out of the war. In mid-October, the ship sailed to Gottenhofen, today what is Gdynia in Poland, for 5 days and attacked a little under 30 targets in the defense of the Baltic coast near Memel, expending almost 1,200 rounds of her main battery guns in company with another heavy cruiser that had recommissioned, the Ltzow, formerly the Deutschland. On the return to Gottenhofen on the night of the 15th at full speed, Prince Eugen rammed the light cruiser Leipzig, which was adrift while making a routine engine coupling transfer. Both ships remained locked together until the next day. Leipzig, although heavily damaged, remained afloat. While Prince Eugen lost a section of her bow, she returned to Gottenhofen yards, where thanks to personal initiative of the naval senior architect, Professor Burkhardt, the same man who had designed the class, a new stem was added on in a few days and tested on the 14th of November. The cruiser was again operational, and on the 20th, in company with the torpedo boats T-21, T-13, T-16, and T-19, bombarded Soviet positions near the Swob Peninsula. After this, she returned to Gottenhofen again, where she was scheduled for a refit and rebore of her guns. The refit work was completed on January 15th, and only 2 weeks later, Prince Eugen and torpedo boats covered the breakout of the 28th Corps from the bridgehead at Krens, Königsberg, where in the defense of these troops, she expended a further 871 rounds of her main battery guns. Still, the Soviet advance could not be stopped by her own or other German guns. Through the coming months of winter and spring 1945, Prince Eugen covered the retreating German army around the Baltic, much like other ships we have discussed like the Ltzow, Admiral Hipper, and Admiral Scheer. On March 7th, the Soviets advanced on the cities of Danzig, Gdynia, and Hel. Prince Eugen was involved in the defense of those cities from March 10th on. In the defense of those cities, a total of 2,025 rounds of 20.3cm and 2,446 15cm shells were fired by the various ships involved in the defense. During this period, Prince Eugen also supported the old pre-dreadnought Schlesien and later the repaired Leipzig. After Hel had been evacuated and abandoned in mid-April, Prince Eugen eventually retired to Copenhagen on April 19th, joining the light cruiser Nürnberg, where to quote Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War, the fate of the enemy fleets after 2 world wars. A considerable number of German vessels were in Danish waters at the time of the surrender, in particular, those involved in the Baltic evacuations. Considerable friction resulted when Danish elements attempted to board German vessels, the latter's crews not recognizing the Danes as victors, only the British to whom they had formerly surrendered under the May 5th agreement. Apart from the big ships, the replenishment ship Nordmark, together with T-47, T-107, T-108, and T-151, and other smaller vessels, had been at Copenhagen on the 7th. Now, we've covered the exploits of the USS Prince Eugen before, so I'll post a link to that video down in the description. I think next we'll look at the last remaining battleships in service for the Kriegsmarine, old, outdated pre-dreadnoughts. We'll only be covering Schlesien in detail, since Schleswig-Holstein was bombed in December 1944 and didn't do anything in 1945 besides sit around and be a hulk and get captured by the Soviets. But it's easier to discuss both, as essentially they're tied at the hip. We'll pick up their career near the end of 1944. Both ships' careers as training ships would soon be overtaken by Germany's worsening military situation. The need to protect convoys in the Baltic from air attack led both Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein to be taken in hand towards the end of 1944 for a major enhancement of their anti-aircraft batteries, as well as a general modernization of equipment, including new generators, to serve as convoy escort ships. As refitted, Schlesien emerged at the end of 1944 with her 4 old 8.8cm guns on the after superstructure replaced by 10.5cm weapons, with an additional pair abreast the bridge, and the light anti-aircraft battery increased. As mentioned previously, Schleswig-Holstein was immobilized in December 1944 and therefore had no significant use. Schlesien, on the other hand, could be quite useful in the defense of the Baltic. By early 1945, with the destruction of Tirpitz and Schleswig-Holstein, Schlesien was the last big gun battleship left to the Kriegsmarine, assisting in the defense of places like Danzig and Gotenhofen, as she used her big guns to try to stave off the advancing Red Army. She, like other vessels, was entrusted with the care of refugees and wounded. However, even her guns weren't enough. Thus, as the war entered its last weeks, the only vessel above destroyer size still operational was the ancient battleship Schlesien, which continued bombardments off what was left of Germany's Baltic coast. But even the old battleship's days were numbered. On May 3rd, she struck a mine off Peenemünde and grounded while in tow towards Swinemünde by the destroyer Z-39, escorted by Z-38. For a short while, she was used as an anti-aircraft battery, but when the port was evacuated the following day, she was scuttled and settled in shallow water. The wreck of the venerable battleship was gradually broken up after the war, only scantily submerged debris being left after 1957. The Panzerschiffs of the Deutschland class are some of my favorite ships, and there were 2 left in service in 1945, Ltzow, the former Deutschland, and the Admiral Scheer. We'll start off with my favorite of the 2, the Admiral Scheer. As 1945 dawned and a major Soviet offensive developed from the Baranau bridgehead in mid-January, vastly superior forces advanced on the German homeland itself, and the few available elements of the German surface fleet became involved in the upcoming battles between German and Soviet forces, as floating artillery batteries against Soviet assembly points and advancing columns of troops. Admiral Scheer spent most of January in Pillau, engaging in those duties, then off the Zamland coast in company with a few remaining torpedo boats. At 11 p.m. on the 18th of January, 1945, at Pillau, Admiral Scheer made fast astern of the night fighter director ship Togo, while she was brought around to give full broadside to bear shoreward. Before dawn on the 19th, Admiral Scheer unleashed her 6 28cm guns and the portside 15cm battery in support of the German land offensive to reopen the Königsberg-Pillau land corridor for the escape of refugees. By first light, the heavy cruiser retired offshore and returned at the same time the following day to bombard Soviet positions for 2 hours from 5 to 7 a.m., the objective of their action being achieved. Like other warships of the Kriegsmarine, she was enlisted in the care of refugees, protecting the overfilled hospital trains and ships, and helping wounded to board other means of transportation. The desperation of the situation in East Prussia at the time called for almost everything that could float to be pressed into service to carry refugees, with small parties from the ship going ashore to secure incomplete torpedo boat hulls to be towed westward. Off Elbing on February 6th, Admiral Scheer bombarded Russian lines at a range of 35 kilometers, expending over 1,000 rounds of her 28cm and 15cm guns. As a result of this and similar operations off Pillau, her guns were in urgent need of reboring. The only workshop that had the machinery to rebore her guns was in Kiel, so the cruiser sailed for the battered German city, in the process taking on refugees and wounded from Gotenhofen. On March 9th, the captain of the Admiral Scheer was told that he could no longer proceed as there was an uncleared minefield, and so he took his ship to Swinemünde to disembark the refugees. Upon arrival, the Admiral Scheer was pressed into service once again by the army to help bombard advancing Soviet troop columns. Over the coming days, the Admiral Scheer expended over 700 rounds of her 28cm and 15cm shells, really pushing the life expectancy of those barrels. As there was no 15cm ammunition in Swinemünde, the cruiser finally sailed for Kiel, not before taking on more refugees and wounded. Arriving on March 18th, where she went to the fitting out base in the Deutsche Werke near the cruisers Admiral Hipper and Emden. As I previously mentioned, by this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. To help in the defenses, the anti-aircraft guns and ammunition aboard the Admiral Scheer were taken off to hopefully provide for the defenses of the city and surrounding area. Unfortunately for the Admiral Scheer, her heavy armament was unserviceable because of the proposed barrel changeovers. B turret completed the exchange on the 8th of April, and because of the constant threat of air attacks, a proposal to bring the ship out into Heikendorf Bay was put forward on the 10th to have a floating crane assist in the exchange of turret barrels. So the following night, when bombers came overhead, a majority of the ship's company was off the ship. Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke have this to say in their book, Pocket Battleships of the Deutschland Class, Warships of the Kriegsmarine. At 9:50 p.m. on the 9th of April, there was an air raid warning and most of the remaining crew went to bunkers ashore, leaving aboard 90 or so officers and men of the damage control parties. The first bombs began falling at 10:30, and the ship was first hit at 10:38 p.m. At 10:45, hits caused lighting and command relay systems to fail, and the cruiser assumed a list of 16 degrees to starboard, but power was restored long enough to get the ground vents open and make compensatory flooding to halt the list at 18 degrees. At just after 10:45, as consequence of further hits and near misses, the list increased quickly to 28 degrees, at which point the engineer officer of the watch gave the command to leave the electrical plant running and gave the command to abandon the ship. The order did not reach all of the centers because of the electrical failures, although individual posts were abandoned as soon as the gravity of the situation became apparent. The remaining crew climbed through burning and smoke-filled rooms to reach companionways and portholes. Some crewmen were killed or injured by falling machinery and components. Despite the asphyxiating condition and their exhaustion, groups dragged injured and unconscious shipmates to safety, those not being able to swim the few strokes to the quayside being picked up in the water by small craft. Salvage workers from Emden cut into the hull in several places, and rescue teams scoured the upturned hull for 42 hours in the search for survivors. Having discharged her ammunition and fuel, Admiral Scheer was high out of the water and ballasted with a small amount of seawater in the double bottom. She capsized over a period of 12 to 17 minutes in 15 meters of water, the primary cause being the large gash on the starboard side caused by near misses. All 8 members of Damage Control Party 1 and 7 other crew members, including 3 engineer cadets, were left entombed in the mangled remains of the ship. The mangled remains of the Admiral Scheer and the other German vessels were captured in the devastated city of Kiel by the advancing British forces in early May 1945. Kiel was largely destroyed in World War II, especially the dock area, since this was a major port city for Germany and the Kriegsmarine. Where in this photo, you can see the Minelayer Bluma, the former Norwegian Olav Tryggvason, and a Type 21 U-boat. There are a number of photos taken of the Admiral Scheer, mostly taken by British authorities, like this one, which reveals 2 things. A really good view of the capsized warship with a prefabricated bow piece of a Type 21 U-boat in the foreground, and the valuable metals that could be salvaged from the warship. Or this photo where you can see the capsized warship in the ruined dockyard along with the bombed-out city of Kiel in the background. The armor plate and propellers found on the ship contain metals that could be reused for other applications. So, under British authorities, work began breaking up the wreck in July 1945, where all valuable metals, gun houses, and turrets were removed before the bare torso of the ship was abandoned where she lay. It seems that she was broken up in a number of ways, being cut up with welding torches and the possible use of explosives. As the scrapping process got on its way, the ship moved slightly to allow for the scrappers to get to parts of the ship above the waterline that were now below. Much of the scrap metal went on to Britain to be processed, and by the following July, the scrapping had come to a completion because of the cost of further efforts to scrap her, as it would require the ship to be towed elsewhere to finish the job. So what was left of the Admiral Scheer, which were pieces of the hull, were left where they sat. By 1945, the reconstruction of Western Germany was beginning, and the principal Baltic naval base of the future and past German Navy was no exception. So when it came time to begin building the new naval arsenal, the remains of the mangled hull were covered over with rubble to become the foundations of a new large parking lot, with the ship's remains most likely being in this area. As for the crew that were entombed in the ship, I could not find a source that says they were removed from the ship. According to the recent survey from the Institute of Geosciences at Kiel University, of which I'll place a link to the survey so you all can read it, the wreck was partially cleared after the war, with the bow removed up to the forward engineering spaces, and the stern was removed to the beginning of the armor belt, with the remaining midship sections cleared down to the waterline and subsequently buried by sand and other debris in the early 1950s, as I mentioned before. Using photographs from the time that she had capsized, and specifically this one from March 29th, 1949, the research team used the surrounding buildings that are still there to find an approximate location of the buried Admiral Scheer, and through the use of magnetic gradiometry, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic induction, and electrical resistivity tomography were all used to help find the remains of the Admiral Scheer, which I can assure you all of those are way above my head. The report concludes by stating that the photo from March 29th, 1949 represents the state in which the Admiral Scheer was buried, which they claim large parts of the hull superstructure has been preserved, though buried under 3 meters or about 10 feet of sand and other debris. You should really go take a look at the paper, it's really very interesting, and they have some of the models they made using the scans, which are amazing. We'll pick up Ltzow's career a little earlier because it's interesting. After the Battle of the Barents Sea in early 1943, Ltzow remained in northern Norway. However, after this failure on January 6th at Führer HQ, Hitler ordered the decommissioning of all heavy units, resulting in the resignation of Admiral Rada, being replaced by Admiral Dönitz, who managed to have the decommissioning order partially rescinded. In March, Ltzow was shifted to Alta Fjord as Tirpitz and Scharnhorst arrived in Bogan Bay. For the next several months, she did not see action as she had problems with her diesel. This caused problems as she was to be battle-ready at all times. Repairs were carried out and she participated in group exercises in July and August. In September, she began the return journey to Germany in stages and made it to the Baltic port of Gottenhofen, with Captain Stange stepping down in November. Captain Konke was appointed her commander in January as an overhaul continued on the ship. The cruiser began working up in March with a full war complement of 1,156 officers and men aboard. After working up, she joined the fleet training group with Prince Eugen, Admiral Scheer, Nürnberg, Emden, torpedo boats, E-boats, and the gunnery target ship Hessen. With summer came shore bombardment practice and battle training in the Gulf of Finland, as it was feared that Finland might leave the war, which the nation soon did. On July 8th, Ltzow took part in the last naval review of German warships. The following week saw Ltzow hoping to protect German land units falling back following the departure of Finland from the war. As the calendar changed to fall, Ltzow, much like the remaining heavy units, began shore bombardments against Soviet forces in Memel near the Schwab Peninsula, in one day expending well over 1,000 shells from her various guns. The naval units worked in rotations, returning to Gottenhofen to rearm. Schwab had fallen by the time she was relieved by the Admiral Scheer on the 23rd of November. Ltzow escaped the devastating bombing of the port city of Gottenhofen in mid-December and moved to Pilau towards the month's end. From February onward, Ltzow, Admiral Scheer, and Prince Eugen worked in rotation to bombard Soviet forces in East Prussia, which on the 8th of that month, escorted by T-8, T-28, and T-33, she bombarded Soviet advance columns off the coast. German defenders in the area were crumbling as a column of refugees hindered their fighting ability. She continued her rotations of shore bombardments and rearming, helping to defend Gottenhofen and other ports, managing to survive several bombing attacks at Swinemunde until the 16th of April, when a British Lancaster bomber achieved a near miss and opened up a large hole on the side of the ship, and she assumed a 56-degree list. 2 1,000-pound bombs also hit the ship in the forward and aft main battery magazines, failing to detonate. She was hit in shallow water, and therefore, with the help of a salvage vessel, she was restored to an even keel, where the starboard 5.9-inch guns and A turret were pumped dry, and by the 28th, she resumed the bombardment of Soviet land forces. Her last commander, Captain Ernst Lange, was appointed in April. By that time, only gunnery personnel remained on the cruiser, as the rest of the crew had been formed into emergency infantry units. Once all the ammunition had been expended, and it was clear that the situation could not improve, the order was given to scuttle the ship. On the 3rd or 4th of May, scuttling charges were set, and she was sunk in place. The eventual fate of the wreck is not known for certain. Some say she was seen at Kronstadt in 1948 and 1949, while it's more likely this was the Admiral Hipper class vessel sold to the USSR. Other sources report that she capsized and sank off Kolberg while under tow, or that she was used in weapons tests. Whatever the case may be, the Ltzow is no longer around, and therefore sunk in some manner following the war. I think something interesting is how a story develops as more information becomes available to not only myself as a writer and researcher, but as it's made available to the general public. One book when making these specific types of videos that I like to look at is Spoils of War: The Fate of Enemy Fleets After Two World Wars by Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant, where they detail the end of Ltzow in a lot of detail, and I'll just paraphrase what they say. Ltzow was partially flooded following her damage from the bomb hits, and salvage work began sometime in late 1946, and she was refloated the following summer, but was required to run pumps constantly. From July 20th through the 22nd, 1947, she was towed to Danzig Bay by the icebreaker Voynets and the tug MB-43, with a number of bombs and shells placed on the ship for upcoming trials. A 250-kilogram bomb was detonated within the ship's conning tower at 8:25 in the morning, blowing a hole in its floor and throwing the rangefinder into the sea. At 12:45, another bomb was detonated, this time a 500-kilogram bomb triggered below decks amidships, destroying the foundation of the catapult and penetrating the main deck. The next two were detonated at 3:45. A 500-kilogram bomb in the forward main battery turret jammed a gun at its max elevation and peeled open the forecastle. At 4:15, the ship began settling forward, 30 degrees, with the bow completely submerged, sinking shortly after in 113 meters of water. Finally, the light cruisers. There were only a couple left afloat in 1945, but they certainly played an important role. The remaining light cruisers were Emden, Köln, Leipzig, and Nuremberg. But to make sense of it, we'll start with the first German light cruiser built following the end of the Great War, Emden. For most of the war, Emden operated in training roles, considering her age and the lack of overhauls, operating in a reduced state in terms of her machinery near the end of the war. The Emden operated in 1943 in that condition, and into 1944, where in September, Emden helped lay mines in Norwegian waters, operating out of Horten and in the Skagerrak. She next assisted in covering troop ships moving in and out of Oslofjord, even running aground in December, where she was holed in Compartment 2, and this damage, combined with the general condition of the machinery, led to repairs in the city of Königsberg. The process was very slow, and by January 23, 1945, as Soviet troops closed on the city, she was prepared to leave with the coffins of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his wife to take them to Pillau. The ship arrived in Pillau with tug assistance at 3 a.m. on the 25th. After unloading the coffins and conducting makeshift repairs, Emden took on board refugees like other Kriegsmarine warships in this video and arrived in Kiel on February 1st after a 6-day voyage at the mercy of Soviet submarines and aircraft. The ship arrived in Kiel and went to the Deutsche Werke shipyard where Emden was subjected to continual air raids. On the 11th of March, the ship was damaged by incendiary bombs. The April 3rd raid also damaged Emden, destroying her forward funnel with a direct hit. In the raid on April 9th, which wrecked the Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hipper, Emden was damaged in her stern by a near miss. She was next seriously damaged on the night of April 13th and towed out into Heikendorf Bay with a list of 15 degrees to port. The cruiser was grounded in shallow water and decommissioned on April 26th. On May 3rd, the ship was scuttled by explosive charges. An interesting photo is this one, where alongside the Emden, you can see a U-boat. Again, this photo was taken by British authorities sometime between May 6th and May 12th, 1945. Or this photograph where you can see a better overall view of the ship and its condition, in which you can see the destroyed forward funnel along with a better view of the U-boat, which at first glance at this photo I thought there were two, but there is in fact only one. Much like the Admiral Hipper, the ship was scrapped over the coming years in place in Heikendorf Bay. Next, we'll discuss my favorite of the light cruisers, Köln, because of how she ended her career. Very interesting use of the ship. The ship was stationed in Norway near the end of 1944, where it was attacked by British planes, where in several attacks, the ship took no direct hits, but serious blast damage, forcing it back to Oslo for dry dock, where unfortunately, the repairs weren't effective, forcing her to Wilhelmshaven on January 4th, 1945. The next several months were filled with continual air raid warnings, where the crew would retreat to a large bunker in the vicinity. This was itself hit on March 30th, with dead and injured amongst civilians and dockyard workers. An air raid warning had been given, and the first bombs fell very quickly afterwards. Before the all-clear had been given, the crew was ordered to the ship to fight fires and salvage personal effects from the stem of the cruiser. Although the fires weren't too serious, It was not possible to enter the after section because the cruiser had a huge list and was in danger of capsizing. Therefore, everybody got ashore as quickly as possible. The crew was then kitted out and sent to the front to fight as infantry. The cruiser, on the other hand, sank on an even keel in the Yard Basin and was decommissioned on April 5th. A party of technicians and weapons personnel remained behind at Wilhelmshaven, as the cruiser was upright. Both B and C turrets were above water, and with a little ingenuity, sending flying cables over to B turret, and with a makeshift wooden platform, the 15-centimeter guns were in working order soon enough. The turrets fired on advancing troops for a few days, but after the capitulation, the wreck was broken up piecemeal when the shipyard was being dismantled. The remains were raised for scrap in 1956 during the rebuilding of the naval arsenal. Another interesting ship, Leipzig, will pick up her story following her repairs from her collision with Prince Eugen. By early March 1945, the cruiser was worked up, and on March 9th, the Soviets were within range of her 15-centimeter guns, firing at positions near the assembly point at Tukum. The Soviets targeted Leipzig, forcing her to change positions very frequently, either within the port or out at sea beyond the range of Soviet artillery. Leipzig fired 920 15-centimeter shells, causing serious damage to that artillery position. On March 17th, the 7th Panzer Division signaled to thank the ship for her outstanding shooting. Her flak crews were also hard at work, trying to deal with the Soviet aircraft overhead, earning themselves decorations. By the 24th of March, there was no 15-centimeter ammunition left, and the ship was moved to Hella to embark 500 refugees and army wounded before heading westward, accompanied by 6 merchant vessels and a few small escorts. She could make only 6 knots in waters patrolled by Soviet submarines. One torpedo was narrowly avoided by a sharp turn to starboard, and on the 26th, Soviet torpedo bombers were driven off, eventually making it to a Danish port. She would remain there until the 30th of June 1945, when under British escort she was brought to Wilhelmshaven. Here she was decommissioned on December 20th, 1945. Because of her desolate condition, she was not wanted by any of the victorious powers, and she was first used as an accommodation ship for minesweeping crews and was scuttled by scuttling charges on July 20th, 1946 in the Skagerrak. Some sources discuss her sinking being part of chemical munitions destruction. Still, due to her sinking by scuttling charges instead of opening seacocks, it's not likely, at least according to Dodson and Kant. Finally, the German cruiser that remained afloat the longest, the Nuremberg. In early 1945, Nuremberg was used to lay mines off the southern tip of Norway and then escorted refugee ships through the swept channels and also ended up in Oslo on the 24th of January. And then she was called to Copenhagen, where she remained until the end of the war. Following the surrender of German forces in northern Germany on May 5th, Danish resistance fighters attempted to seize the cruiser, and both sides suffered losses in a fierce gunfight in the dockyards of Copenhagen. Later on the 22nd, the ship was told to go to Wilhelmshaven, and 2 days later, a convoy including the heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire, Prince Eugen in Nuremberg, and HMS Dido, along with destroyers, left for Wilhelmshaven, entering the port on the 26th. According to the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, the victorious powers agreed the German fleet was to be shared amongst themselves by February 15, 1946. There were suspected attempts to scuttle the German ships by their crews to prevent them from reaching Allied control, especially Soviet. So without prior notice, on December 18, 1945, the German ships were taken over. On January 2, 1946, Nuremberg, wearing the flag of a Soviet vice admiral, left Wilhelmshaven for the Soviet Union only after encountering troubles with the locks. Eventually, Nuremberg reached Ltzow, where the German crew was taken off and returned to Wilhelmshaven. Nuremberg was renamed Admiral Makarov and used as a training ship by the Soviet Navy. The torpedo tubes, light flak, and searchlight platforms were removed, and Russian electronic equipment was installed. Her outward appearance remained the same. She served in the Soviet Navy until 1960, when she was decommissioned, making her the longest-serving Kriegsmarine cruiser. There you have it, folks, the last remaining ships of the Kriegsmarine afloat. I know some of you will be disappointed by the fact I didn't cover the destroyers, but it really will not have been interesting. What I could cover in the future is the last battle at sea for the Kriegsmarine. Let me know what you think about that. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow.